From the earliest times, people have believed that spirits remain at their place of death or burial. The Greek philosopher Plato wrote of souls that roam about tombs and burial grounds. At the Tower of London, the spirits of the men and women who lived and died in this ancient building, part palace, part prison, seem to have been absorbed into the very walls. The tower and its surroundings are pregnant with images from its turbulent past. Some of them are still seen today. The tower's colourful rituals conceal a dark past, drenched in betrayal and murder. The red coats of the guardsmen recall the blood that has flowed here. Few places in the tower have a more sinister reputation than Traitor's Gate, the Watergate on the Thames through which prisoners were brought to the tower to avoid popular demonstrations. Many came by this way, few went out. At the top of these steps lay the rack and the thumbscrew. There was one final destination. The block and the executioner's axe, seldom a swift end to the victim's life. Caught in the beady eyes of the tower's guardian ravens. It was in the tower that King Richard III imprisoned the two infant princes, Richard and Edward, the sons of his brother, King Edward IV. And it was here that he had them murdered. Certainly they were never seen again. The ghosts of the princes still haunt the bloody tower, forlorn in their nightgowns and holding hands. For the never-ending stream of tourists who visit the tower, one of the grimmest of its sights is the execution block on the green. King Henry VIII kept the axemen busy. Execution was a favoured solution to the political and marital difficulties the king encountered. In 1536, his second wife, Anne Boleyn, was arrested and sentenced to death on trumped-up charges. The Queen's house at the Tower had been built for Anne in 1530, but the only time she stayed there was while she was awaiting execution. Her headless ghost is still seen on the site. The grisliest ghost to haunt the site is that of the aged Countess of Salisbury, executed by Henry VIII in 1540. The old woman refused to put her head on the block and was hacked to death as she ran around the green. It is said that the shadow of a huge axe sometimes falls over the spot where she died. The Elizabethan courtier and adventurer Sir Walter Raleigh was imprisoned in the Tower for 16 years under sentence of death. He enjoyed a measure of freedom within its walls, regularly strolling the battlements. Raleigh was housed in comfortable quarters. Here he busied himself with the writing of an epic history of the world. Sir Walter's own part in it came to an end in 1618, when, after a brief spell of freedom, he was executed for high treason. His ghost is still seen pacing the battlements, gazing out over the modern cityscape beyond. Or perhaps Sir Walter sees the spires and meadows of his own days in captivity. Another royal palace and another royal ghost. The gallery at Hampton Court is haunted by the ghost of Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. She was held in the palace before her own execution for adultery. The marriage had lasted barely 15 months. One night, Catherine escaped and had to be dragged shrieking from the doors of the chapel where her husband was at prayer. Her screams have echoed down the centuries and have been heard in our own day. Fulham Palace, ancient home of bishops on the banks of the Thames, is famous for its beautiful gardens, laid out in the 17th century, and for its ghosts. In the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary, its great hall was used by Bishop Bonner to torture Protestants. Bloody Bonner's own tortured spirit remains, as the warden attests.
He was dressed in a very long black cloak, a high wing collar going right up the back of the neck and round the ears. He carried on very slowly up the threshold of this net. Being that he was very tall, he had to stoop his head as he went through the door.
Glamis, the fairy tale Scottish castle of the Earls of Strathmore and childhood home of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Glamis has many ghosts, including that of Lady Jane Douglas, the so-called Grey Lady, who was burned as a witch in the 16th century. But Glamis also harbours a terrible secret, the details of which are made known only to the Strathmore heir on his 21st birthday. Legend has it that over the centuries a secret chamber has housed the hideously deformed descendants of the 3rd Earl of Strathmore, the notorious libertine who was condemned by the devil to drink and gamble until Judgment Day. The story goes that if you hang sheets from every window in Glamis, there is always one which remains empty. Versailles, near Paris in France, the vast palace built by Louis XIV. Here in 1901, 2 English spinsters had a strange adventure. Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain took a stroll in the gardens on a hot and thundery afternoon. There was a strange atmosphere about the place, as if the oppressive heat had somehow made the geometrically organized landscape almost two-dimensional. The walkers headed through the mock village built by Marie Antoinette, where the doomed queen had played at being a shepherdess. In an atmosphere almost tingling with static, they encountered a strange group of people dressed in 18th century costume. Had they stumbled through a gate in time to the eve of the French Revolution? The date was the 10th of August, the very day in 1792 when Marie Antoinette and her husband, Louis XVI, had been seized by the mob. Or had the 2 women been deceived by Parisian socialites in fancy dress? In August 1914, the summer thunder was drowned by the rumble of guns in the opening battles of the First World War. The British and the French rushed troops to the front to halt the German drive on Paris. At the moment when the Germans threatened to break through the British line at Mons, a fantastic apparition gave the outnumbered British soldiers heart. It was said that the sky had been filled with the ghostly figures of Henry V's archers, being led to victory at Agincourt by St. George. In fact, the vision had been invented by a British journalist, Arthur Machen, a student of the occult. But thousands of soldiers claimed that they had seen the figures in the sky. In the process, they became angels rather than archers. Similar stories circulated in the French and German armies. But by the time of the Somme offensive in 1916, with the casualties running in millions, there was not much comfort to be gained from the vision of the Angel of Mons. Yet the story has long outlived Arthur Machen and has become one of the persistent myths of the First World War. During that terrible conflict, the life expectation of aviators at the front could be measured in weeks. These confident, vigorous young men were lambs to the slaughter. At the height of the war in the air, there were many examples of what psychic investigators call crisis apparition, the sudden appearance of a loved one who is both far away and about to die. Early in the morning of the 19th of March 1917, a British airman, Eldred Boyer, was shot down and killed in France. Less than 12 hours later, he appeared, smiling and seemingly as large as life, to his sister, a Mrs. Spearman, while she sat knitting in an hotel in Calcutta. Was some form of telepathy at work, triggered by family anxiety over the young airman and the trauma of his death in the skies over France? On her maiden voyage in 1915, The second officer of the German submarine U-65 was killed in an accidental explosion. The dead man did not desert his ship. He was seen at regular intervals on the deck, his ghastly white face turned up towards the men on the conning tower. The submarine was plagued by accidents and bad luck. The captain claimed it was all a practical joke, but the crew was convinced that the ship was haunted. On the 10th of July, 1918, U-65 was torn apart by a terrible internal explosion that was witnessed by an American submarine which had been stalking her. The U-boat's crew of 35 went down with her. Or was it 36? Certainly it was the last that was ever seen of the haunted submarine's phantom second officer. Today, the hillsides of the Towy Valley in Wales are regularly buzzed by low-flying Tornado fighter bombers. But in 1979, a more mysterious aircraft of World War II vintage was seen flying over the valley. It was a Wellington bomber. In the war years, Wellingtons were a common sight, but now there is only one left, housed in the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon. Had the Towy Valley Wellington crashed on a wartime training flight, but somehow remained airborne over 30 years later? Several witnesses reported that the bomber made no sound as it flew on its lonely mission, lost in space and time. RAF stations seem particularly prone to hauntings. The medium Eddie Burke was called in to solve a sequence of apparitions at RAF Linton-on-Ouse.
Just as I walked out of the door, a figure was stood just where you are, about 6 foot tall, quite broad-shouldered. It was a shadowy figure, and the figure just stayed there and then moved towards the left, towards the approach room door. A couple of months later, I was coming down from local, coming down these stairs, and I just walked past this door here, and this figure was stood there again.
No.
Eddie goes into a trance in an attempt to contact the spirit.
The feelings I'm getting at the moment are that this man that you've seen was killed, I think, somewhere in this vicinity out on the airfield. I think it was just an ordinary accident. I think he was run down by a vehicle at night. And his back was broken and he was in some considerable pain.
RAF records later revealed that in 1950 a young aircraftsman had been killed by a petrol tanker on a runway. Later, Eddie Burke was asked how he uses his psychic power.
And how does one use it? Well, I use it myself in order to help release entities, people, who have died and haven't progressed to the level they should have done.
There seemed to be spirits aplenty at Borley Rectory in Essex, reputedly the most haunted house in Britain. In the early 1930s, the Reverend Lionel A. Foyster moved in with his daughter, Marianne. Foyster's journals record the strange events which ensued. They revolved around Marianne, who claimed to have been turned out of her bed and physically attacked by the forces at large in the dilapidated and sinister Victorian house, built, local legend had it, on the site of a medieval monastery. Scribbled messages in a childish hand appeared on the walls. Was Marianne the cause of this poltergeist activity? The Reverend Foyster's journals record hundreds of incidents in which crockery disappeared and then returned, doors suddenly locked, and books flew off the shelves. Altogether, the Reverend Foyster catalogued some 2,000 inexplicable incidents at Borley, most of them during his first 2 years there with Marianne. But the household at Borley contained secrets every bit as strange as the poltergeists which plagued the hapless man of God. The celebrated psychic investigator Harry Price came to the rectory in 1931 and concluded that the problems there were only of psychological interest. Had he sensed that something was awry at Borley Rectory? And what did he mean? Significantly, perhaps, the Reverend Foyster had previously lived in Amherst, Nova Scotia, the scene of a famous poltergeist manifestation in 1878. Even more intriguingly, Marianne was not the Reverend Foyster's daughter, but his wife. Marianne herself, who hated Borley Rectory from the day they moved in, was also bigamously married to a traveling salesman called Henry Fisher. Fisher lived at Borley with Marianne and the Reverend Foyster in a ménage à trois. Marianne was to bear Fisher 2 children, but when war came, Fisher was supplanted by an American GI stationed in England. Marianne returned with him to America, where she disappeared from the pages of psychic history. The Foysters left Borley in 1935. Harry Price returned, this time to conduct research which produced a book in which he claimed the rectory was the most haunted house in England. It burned down in mysterious circumstances in 1939. But ghosts can just as easily haunt modern airliners. In December 1971, a Lockheed TriStar, Flight 401, crashed in the Florida Everglades. It seems that some of its spare parts were used in other planes. Subsequently, there was a series of ghostly sightings of Flight 401's captain, Robert Loft, and second officer, Dan Repo, on several Eastern Airlines flights. Loft and Repo seemed to be trying to warn the flight crew about safety hazards. They had been unaware of the fault which had led to the crash of their TriStar. Had this disaster preyed so heavily on the spirits of the dead airmen that they were watching over the aircraft which contained the spare parts from Flight 401? The modern world of California has spawned a number of variations on ancient ghostly themes. Some of these have become lodged in the public mind as urban myths, handed down from teller to teller, much as ancient stories of vampires and banshees were in former times. In turn, these tales have spread around the world, giving us an insight into the ancient origins of ghost stories and how they persist in the era of the tower block and the internet. The old tale of the phantom traveler has been replaced by that of the phantom hitchhiker, the unaccompanied figure encountered on some lonely road who accepts a lift from a passing motorist and, while the vehicle is in motion, mysteriously disappears. Investigation of these incidents sometimes leads to the identification of people killed in car crashes near the spot where the hitchhiker was picked up. Sometimes they are accompanied by warnings of danger, rather like that of the airmen killed in Flight 401. Is it an old tale given a new twist, or another example of restless spirits reenacting tragic events? San Francisco is one of the most sophisticated cities in the United States, a cultural jewel on the West Coast and a magnet for tourists from all over the world. They come to enjoy the spectacular skyline on San Francisco Bay, the seafood restaurants of Fisherman's Wharf, and the superb scenery of the Pacific coastline. San Francisco's confident modern waterfront does not suggest the supernatural. And while the city's famous cable cars provide a link with the past, they are comforting enough. But in the bay itself, there is another, more sinister feature previously forbidden to the public: Alcatraz, the escape-proof prison which from 1934 housed many of America's most dangerous criminals. The grim prison on the rock was a place of pure punishment, from which there was no hope of escape. Pain and suffering soaked into its walls. Al Capone, Alcatraz's most famous inmate, went mad here from the effects of syphilis. He spent much of his time aimlessly strumming a banjo. The prisoners' cells were grim enough, but most dreaded of all were those set aside for solitary confinement, particularly those in cell block 14D, where men would be stripped and left in total darkness. In 1963, Alcatraz was closed as a prison and open to the public. Guards and tour guides have reported hearing the distant clang of metal doors, screams and sobbing. Cell block 14D has an inexplicably bitter chill to it. Today you can enjoy a dinner party in Alcatraz. Diners claim they sometimes hear the faint jangling of a banjo, a ghostly reminder of the days when Al Capone was lodged in this legendary prison. In the 1970s, books about London's ghosts began to include the tale of a 17th century vicar who haunted the docks at Wapping. But it turned out that he had been invented by a journalist, Frank Smythe.
Well, in fact, the whole thing, the vicar and the witnesses, is a complete fabrication.
Smythe was merely filling a column on a magazine devoted to the occult. But like Arthur Machen before him, his artfully contrived fiction was readily accepted as fact, and sightings were soon being reported. Perhaps the ghost of the evil vicar of Wapping really does exist. In the world of the supernatural, nothing is quite what it seems. Even today's ghost hunters are reluctant to commit themselves to what a ghost really is. The field is wide open to the machinations of fraudsters and the wild claims of the deluded. Were the events at Borley Rectory stage-managed by the bigamous Marianne Foyster? Or was there something more sinister at work in the old dark house? Were the hard-headed submariners of U-65 in the grip of a collective delusion? They were so panicked by the ghostly visits of their dead shipmate that a senior officer was called in to interview each man. He ordered the transfer of the entire crew to another ship, and the submarine was then exorcised. But on her second trip with a new crew, the spirit reappeared. There is a belief that some hauntings can be explained by the fact that traces of particularly intense or traumatic events are absorbed in the fabric of a building where they took place, and then, in certain circumstances, replayed. Is the Tower of London a huge stone tape recorder, waiting for the psychic button to be pressed to give us fleeting glimpses of its extraordinary past? Mediums like Eddie Burke seem to be able to communicate with the restless spirits of the dead. Burke's sincerity is obvious, but even he would admit that the problems he unravels often leave him with more questions than answers. At the heart of the world's great religions, there are mysteries which require a leap of faith. The symbols of religion, its statues, icons, and rituals, are the outward expression of that faith. And in themselves, they generate devotion among the faithful. Although we live in a world dominated by seemingly miraculous technologies, the Middle Ages are, for many, only a step away. The relics of saints are still venerated and credited with healing powers. For many millions, the age of miracles is not yet past. They crave signs and wonders. The physical proof of the existence of the God they worship is a vital factor in their daily lives. The cult of the Virgin Mary is a powerful force in the faith of many Roman Catholics. Since the Middle Ages, it has been linked with the phenomenon of weeping Madonnas, statues which shed blood or tears. To skeptics, these incidents provide evidence of the survival into the scientific age of primitive and superstitious beliefs. But there is evidence that such things do happen. The case of the weeping Madonnas continues to inspire the faithful and perplex the curious to this day. There is more to this than meets the eye. In the 1950s, an Italian physician, Dr. Piero Casoli, made a detailed investigation of weeping Madonnas. He had his work cut out, concluding that at least 2 such incidents were reported every week in Italy alone. West Wicklow, in the green heart of rural Ireland. In 1995, there was a remarkable happening in the sleepy village of Grangecon. A statue of the Virgin Mary, owned by Mary Murray, began to weep blood-red tears. Mary's daughter, Attracta O'Hara, takes up the story.
Well, it was a Monday morning. It was a beautiful day. The sky was real blue. And I came down here and I decided to clean up the kitchen here for my mother because I don't live here. The kitchen was upside down. And I passed the window and I looked in at the statue and I just said, oh, what happened to Our Lady's face? And I left down the sack of rubbish that I had and I came back and I looked at it again. And I looked at it again, I said, is this for real now or am I imagining it?
So I come in, she handed me the statue and in the box as it was, and I took the box in my hand. And there it was, a red down one side, 2 eyes of bloodshed, and there was water or some liquid running down the other side of the face.
Grangecon became a place of pilgrimage. The faithful and the curious came to inspect Mary Murray's statue. Mary became a mini celebrity. The statue continued to shed tears. However, the local priest, Father Gary Doyle, remained skeptical, since the manufacturers could provide a rational explanation for the tears.
The eyes of the statue are kept in place by an adhesive substance, and they state that in certain temperatures, this adhesive substance may melt or liquefy and cause the symptoms that are visible on the statue in Grangecon. And that's, for me, a reasonable explanation, possible explanation.
Nevertheless, Mary Murray and the faithful remain firmly convinced that a little miracle has happened in Grange Con. A world away in the streets of Chicago, the power of faith seems just as strong. The pace of life is light years quicker here than in Grange Con, but it can be slowed temporarily to the speed of a tear trickling down the cheek of a plaster statue of the Virgin Mary. In the 1980s, the congregation of this Roman Catholic church in Chicago maintained that a statue of the Virgin Mary was weeping at regular intervals. Few could doubt their sincerity. And as the statue itself was an object of worship, the mysterious appearance of liquids on it was interpreted in a religious context, although no one could be sure of its precise meaning. Some suggested that the tears flowed in response to powerful images of devotion focused collectively by the congregation. Doubters dismissed the tears as condensation. However, in contrast to such alarming psychic manifestations as poltergeist activity, the tears on the face of the Madonna seemed to restore rather than terrify. The Weeping Madonna had become not only a tourist attraction, but also a focus of prayer and devotion for those who came to see her. Whether the phenomenon is real or imagined, it stirs real emotions. On the other side of Chicago, in an Orthodox church, an icon of the Virgin Mary was also shedding tears. The idea of a weeping Mary is derived from the image of her at the foot of the cross at the moment when her own sorrow at the death of her son symbolizes the sorrow of the human race for the death of Christ. Her tears also stand as a symbol of mediation, for what son can refuse the tears of a mother? A shrine was built around the icon while worshippers satisfied themselves that the tears continued to flow. In the early 1950s, scientists analyzed the tears shed by the celebrated Weeping Madonna of Syracuse. They noted the presence of sodium and chlorine, which are constituents of human tears, but they found no traces of the substances of which the image had been made. In Syracuse, a vast new basilica has risen to house the miraculous object. In comparison, the shrine at the Church of St. Nicholas is a humble affair, but it provokes the same reactions in the faithful as they gaze on the face of the Virgin, a sense of expectation and wonder, and a feeling of an experience shared. St. Jerome once observed that tears torment the devil more than do the pains of hell. In 1996, in Clearwater, Florida, thousands flocked to see a vision of the Virgin Mary which appeared on the tinted windows of an office building. It possessed the outline of a hooded robe and stirred some to trance-like devotions. Others, less convinced, claimed that the image was caused by the reflections thrown off by sprinkler water. The crowds which massed outside the building threatened to bring traffic to a halt. A trick of the light, or evidence of God's presence in the world? 4 years earlier, the police in Marlborough, New Jersey, had grappled with a similar influx when 6,000 people arrived hoping to catch a glimpse of the Virgin Mary. The pilgrimage was prompted by Joseph Januszkiewicz, who claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared to him in the back garden of his home. The pilgrims gathered before the shrine which Januszkiewicz had erected to the vision, but those hoping to witness the Virgin's return were in for a disappointment. Many vowed to come back, although the price of devotion was a $5 parking fee near the site where the Virgin Mary had appeared. In Jordan, in 1978, thousands of Christians descended on the small town of Madaba, 21 miles south of Amman. Their destination was a Greek Orthodox church, already famous for its ancient mosaic map of the Holy Land in the 6th century. Now the crowds jostled for a glimpse of a miraculous icon of the Virgin Mary, which had been suffused with light and had grown a third arm. Local residents claimed that sick people anointed in the church had experienced remarkable recoveries. Was this the work of the icon and its mysterious additional arm? Miracles are not confined to the Christian faith. In September 1995, Hindus across the world were gripped by the fastest spreading religious rumor in history. It had started in India, but quickly reached Britain, where there is a large Hindu community. The Vishwa Temple in Southall, a suburb of London, became the focus of media attention as thousands of Hindus flocked to witness the spoon-feeding of the god Ganesh with milk. What seemed to be miraculous was that the temple statues were actually absorbing the milk.
I had observed it, I had experienced it myself. And by being the first, probably in the whole of England, I feel Lord Shiva has chosen me.
The statues of Hindu gods are ritually fed every day. At this time of year, milk is offered for the souls of ancestors, but the consumption of the milk by the statues was an unprecedented phenomenon. In Southall, the local supermarket sold out its entire stock of nearly 30,000 pints of milk in a single day. Aided in part by the internet, the Ganesh phenomenon raced through Asia and the Far East.
I did it out of curiosity and out of respect. And since it happened, I believed it with my own eyes. Otherwise, I would not have.
Some suggested that the real cause of the milk drinking was capillary action, a kind of weeping Madonna process in reverse. Substances like alabaster and sandstone can absorb liquids quite fast, but many of the milk-drinking statues were tiny or made of metal. Capillary action cannot account for the litres of milk they are said to have consumed. At the height of the Hindu milk-drinking frenzy, it was claimed that a statue of the Blessed Virgin in the English town of Runcorn was performing the same feat. In Italy, the more traditional manifestation was that of the weeping Madonna of Civitavecchia, said to have shed tears of blood. The statue, which had become an object of veneration, was eventually removed for scientific examination. Its return was eagerly awaited. A cavalcade of cars, led by the Bishop of Civitavecchia, sped up to the cheers of the crowd. The statue of the Virgin was held aloft. And the scientists' verdict? The blood was human, but its origin unknown. The vexed question of origin hangs like a thundercloud over the greatest religious mystery of all, the Turin Shroud. Is this the face of Jesus Christ, imprinted on the shroud in which he was wrapped after he was taken down from the cross? The shroud is a 14-foot piece of linen, showing a full-sized back and front image of a crucified man. The image bears evidence of scourging wounds, a crown of thorns, and the signs of crucifixion. But 1,300 years lie between the crucifixion and the first recorded appearance of the shroud in 1357, near Troyes in France. It quickly gained an early reputation as an ingenious fake. In 1389, the Bishop of Troyes, one Pierre d'Assy, sent a report to Pope Clement VII, in which he claimed to know the artist who had painted the image. The shroud's first known owner was a minor nobleman, Geoffrey de Charnay. In 1450, the de Charnays sold the shroud on to the Duke of Savoy, and in 1578 it was lodged behind bars in Turin Cathedral. The shroud's negative image was only revealed when it was photographed for the first time in 1898. Since then, the shroud has revealed itself, bit by bit, with each advance in the technology applied to investigating it. In 1978, an American scientific team was allowed to subject the shroud to close scrutiny. Infrared, X-rays, and ultraviolet light probed its secrets. Sticky tape removed the tiniest of fabric samples for chemical analysis. But after 4 years studying the shroud, the scientists remained divided.
I think there was a body shape under the shroud when the image was formed.
I'm certain that the shroud was painted during the Middle Ages by an artist.
No way whatsoever is this what could be termed a painting.
If it's supposed to have been made by the hand of man, the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly against it.
The story of the shroud is full of paradoxes, and in recent years there have been ingenious experiments to determine how the image might have been transferred from a human body to the linen cloth. One such took place under the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. The driving force behind the experiment was Sister Damien, a Carmelite nun and qualified archaeologist who lives in Salt Lake City.
And my novice mistress came in and started looking at the photos with me, and she mentioned that he must have, the person whose image is on the shroud, must have had a terrible fever. And the minute she said that, it all started to fall together.
Sister Damien consulted a local undertaker, Michael O'Donnell. Could bodies heat up rather than cool after death?
Is the fact that cellular death occurs later and that the cells are still active, and however the metabolic processes of naturally cooling the body have ceased, and a body can reach a temperature of up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit.
Combined with the heat exhaustion brought on by crucifixion, which also raises the body temperature, this might have scorched an image onto the shroud. With the help of a colleague, Dr. Jim Strange, Sister Damien decided to test her theory in a limestone tomb in Jerusalem. A medical mannequin stood in for the body of Christ. First, Dr. Strange sprayed it with an acid sweat solution. Then he and his wife Caroline filled the mannequin with warm water, bringing it to a temperature of 117 degrees Fahrenheit, which simulated the effects of a post-mortem fever. The wrists and ankles were tied in the position shown on the shroud. After a final spraying with a mixture of blood, myrrh, and aloes, traces of all of which have been found on the Turin shroud, the mannequin was taken to the tomb. Here, Dr. Strange wrapped it in a shroud and left it for 24 hours.
We're looking at the results of the experiment. This is number 4. This is our last shroud. What we're looking at is a human body from the shoulders down to the feet. The image is formed exactly like the image on the shroud. That is, it's formed by dehydration of the fibers themselves.
Inconclusive, perhaps, but the experiment did produce an image which chemically matched the Turin shroud. But could carbon dating pinpoint the age of the shroud?
I would feel quite confident that the carbon date would show that the shroud was created in about 1350.
If the carbon date were to turn out to be in the Middle Ages, it would be, in my opinion, and those of most of my colleagues, much more remarkable miracle than if it were that of the resurrection.
Well, if it turned out to be a date other than the 1st century, I'd hate to be in a position to work out what it really is.
In 1988, scientists who carbon-dated fragments of the shroud at 3 separate institutions in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States concluded that the shroud was no more than 550 years old. It had been made in the mid-14th century, which, coincidentally, was when it was first heard of. The believers hit back, claiming that the fragments of the shroud which had been carbon-dated were bits of its medieval patching. Others argued that the image may have been transferred in Christ's tomb by some radiation flash, which would have made any attempt to carbon-date the shroud pointless. But in 1988, the Vatican's Cardinal Anastasio Balestrero announced that there was a 95% certainty that the shroud dated from the 14th century. One of the most plausible theories was that the shroud had been painted. If so, how was it done? In a modern experiment, artist Susan Hilton painted a similar piece of cloth with a medieval mixture of alum and a pigment made of Brazil wood. She painted an image in negative, just like the one on the shroud. This was then aged. Finally, the cloth was washed, as it had been in the 15th century, to test its authenticity. The result was an image hauntingly reminiscent of the Shroud Man. The photographs of the shroud taken at the end of the 19th century had revealed for the first time that the image on the cloth was in negative. But could the image itself have been a medieval photograph? South African art historian Dr. Nick Allen.
For example, they had light-sensitive chemicals like silver sulfate and silver nitrate. Also, lenses were available. The Venetians, for example, made spectacle lenses in 1275.
In his garden, Dr. Allen used a window to project a point of light into a darkened room to make an image of a plaster figure using only medieval materials to reflect maximum light. 4 days of sunlight produced an upside-down image scorched onto a linen cloth. Like Susan Holt's painting, it presents a negative image. Reversed, it becomes a primitive photograph. These are only 2 of the many possible explanations, but the shroud itself has not yet yielded all its secrets. The question remains, if the shroud is medieval and the image is neither photographic nor painted, could a human model have been used to fake the image of Christ? Had the forger used a horribly tortured human guinea pig? To the believers in miracles, scientific proof or disproof is ultimately of no relevance. Faith is not the product of rational argument. The reflections in an office building window can become evidence of God's presence in the world. But perhaps the last word on religious mysteries should go to Father Gary Doyle, the priest in Grangecon. Father Doyle, who also helps to run a home for young people with learning difficulties, prefers to see the evidence of God in people, rather than in the tears running down the face of a plaster statue of the Virgin Mary. But the yearning of millions for signs and wonders is as strong as ever. As we move into the 21st century, there is no slackening in the reports of miraculous events. Perhaps we do still live in an age of miracles.